This video is intended to help you with the final examination. I'm going to start talking about what we call the literary canon, and then I'm going to talk about American literature specifically, which is your focus in the final exam. The exam asks you to pick two, maybe three criteria by which you would make a judgment about what literature counts as American, quote unquote. But one of the issues that raises is what exactly counts as what we call canonical literature. The word canon comes actually from the Latin rule, and what we mean by it is works that are of literary value that are meant to be studied in courses like ours. For decades, the literary canon was pretty well fixed. The kinds of works that we've been reading are the same kinds of works that I read 50 years ago when I took an American literature course in college, and that started me on my own study of American literature. But over time, especially in the last 20, 30, 40 years, the canon has expanded, and writers of color, younger writers, more women, more specifically political writers have been included. It is a very complicated issue, and nobody has an absolute set of standards or a set of rules. So your criteria, your ideas, are as good as anybody else's. In the United States, for probably 200 years, the canon was heavily weighted towards British authors. We would have read Shakespeare and Milton. We would have read Pope or Henry Fielding, who wrote Tom Jones. We would have read Wordsworth or Keats or Dickens. And we would have considered these authors to be innately superior to American ones. And American authors would have been considered innately inferior. That begins to change just before and during and after World War I, and it begins to take on a life of its own after the Second World War, not simply coincident with the fact that America becomes a world power, but rather that as a world power, we now have the right to kind of assert ourselves as a culture, and particularly as a literary culture, equal to anything done anywhere in the world. That point of view, however, is itself controversial in canon formation. Here are some other things to think about. One of the issues that canon formation involves is who gets to choose. Is it the editors of textbooks? Is it teachers like me? Is it folks like yourselves who are consumers of this kind of literature? Are there things that can knock people out of the canon because our contemporary society has changed its view on certain issues? Like, do we let literary works that contain the N-word used uncritically, do those get to stay? Or do we have to remove those from the canon? The classic example of this, of course, is Mark Twain and Huckleberry Finn, where you see the frequent use of the N-word. But of course, one of the major characters is a slave. The setting is in 1850s Missouri. And so there's a notion here that it was of its time in terms of the language, but that the themes, the issues, the content of the novel beyond that keep a work like Huckleberry Finn in the canon. But that, again, is not a universally held value. In our course, for instance, we have private history, which uses the N-word, although not much. We have the Paul Laurence Dunbar dialect poems that people, even in his own time, objected to as sounding too contrived, too stereotypical of African American speech. And people thought it was disrespectful even then, although times have perhaps modified that judgment a little bit. Another issue that comes up is the issue of sexuality. Most canonical fiction traditionally concerns heterosexual relationships. And now, of course, we have more than two genders. We recognize same-sex attraction. We recognize people who don't fit into conventional gender stereotypes or conventions. And so do they get a place? And if they get a place, does that knock anybody out? The old standard, the notion of, well, this has stood the test of time, I think is a little bit of a dead end in the sense that people tend to teach what they were taught. That is certainly partly true in my case in a course. And so the fact that something was studied 50 years ago and it's been studied ever since doesn't really mean that it has an intrinsic quality necessarily that demands it be studied, but rather it suggests that people just do what they kind of were taught to do. And then this other last question is one that we might want to consider about what exactly do we need to transmit culture from one group to another? What does it mean to be educated? And then, what does it mean within that context to evaluate certain literary text for certain characteristics? So it is an extraordinarily complicated issue. I should mention that these 5 authors are among the richest in the world. Some of them you can probably recognize. This is J.K. Rowling, the Harry Potter person. This is James Patterson, the thriller novelist. And of course, you probably all recognize Stephen King, and you probably recognize John Grisham, the lawyer novelist. And this, of course, is Susan Collins. And who has written a number of romance books. And so these are folks that we don't study as a rule in the canon, but they are extraordinarily popular and successful. It's not necessary that somebody be popular to be in the canon, but maybe there's some other standards that we might want to take a look at. Here's some more on this idea of being in the canon. We've already talked a little bit about language that might be seen as exclusionary or discriminatory, like the N-word or, again, some of Dunbar's language in his dialect poems. We might also consider the depth of characterization. Do they go beyond types? Do they go beyond stereotypes? Do they go beyond the kind of people who seem kind of two-dimensional, and do we have fully developed characters that we can see as real living human beings? Okay, we can look at issues of plot. Is the plot believable? Is it predictable? Does it rely on tricks or contrivances to make it happen? I always think of some of the double poisoning in Romeo and Juliet, for instance, as at some level certainly contrived. This idea of deeper resonances, which is a term I like to use, is it literature that makes us think differently after we've read it? I would certainly look at Sonny's Blues, for instance, as one of those stories that makes us see the kinds of people that we meet in that story who are in many ways stunningly unattractive people. I mean, the narrator is not necessarily a nice guy. He doesn't treat his brother very well. And Sonny is a drug addict. These are people who we would normally, in our daily lives, might not see as heroic figures, but certainly in the context of that story, they would stand out. I think, as again, this goes to this idea of a story has to go beyond the limits of the text itself. Does it connect to a larger world? And as I said, does it make things differently? Something to think about here is this idea that a literary text shouldn't just reflect its historical period. Like if you look at Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, for instance, it's clearly a Civil War story, but it certainly goes beyond that in terms of what Bierce does with the bare bones of the plot and the character that we are provided. And you could certainly look on that story as having far larger implications. It has legs, to use a theater term, that because the issues that it raises, the complexity of the story, certainly adds to the depth of it. And we keep coming back to it and thinking, are we like Peyton? Are we the Union captain? Are we the soldiers? Where do we stand in that story? And even though it's set in a particular time, it's not fixed forever. The moral situation of that story is not fixed forever in that particular moment. Here's some other canonical considerations, and these come from other people. John Gardner, a literary critic who died about 20 years ago, argues that literature has to have a moral value, and we have to take some kind of moral lesson away from it. You can decide what among the various stories that we've read this semester do in fact have a moral component. A second criteria that we might want to think about is people who were left out, and now do we let them in? And someone like James Baldwin, who is actually famous in his own lifetime, seems to be experiencing a kind of renaissance right now. But he's a gay African-American writer. And in his own time, that limited how he was treated. partly because he was African American and partly because of his sexuality, which was very much hidden and certainly not discussed in the 50s and the 60s in the way that we look at gay and lesbian writers now. Okay. Um, so there are some considerations to think about in that regard. Do people try something different? And you could certainly look at E. E. Cummings, for instance, and his lowercase poems, his shoving words together, his unusual images, or we could look at Eliot or even Pound poetry and see where they're playing with language in different kinds of ways. Another way is to use kind of the historical poem or story and see how it shows up in our own time. One of the questions I asked you for the last go round in the discussion board was, what if we put the wound dresser and facing it side by side? What kinds of things do we see that are similar? What kind of things do we see that are different? Does the Kumanyaka poem, written by an African American poet after the Vietnam War, does it have any connection with a poem written about 150 years before by Walt Whitman? The reverse of this is the idea of somebody who's contemporary, somebody who has shifted our way of thinking about language or theme or the subject matter in a different kind of way. An example of this might be Natasha Trethewey's poems about the Louisiana Native Guard, an African American group of Union soldiers, the first such group in the Civil War, and how they were treated and how we remember them. That might be something that we might want to consider when we consider who fits into this and who doesn't. Okay, F.R. Leavis, the British critic, said this before World War II, that great literature must have what he calls a reverent openness before life. It has to be sort of in awe of its subject and make us feel that sense of awe as well. In the area in Blackboard, where I've put some resources for you to look at, one of the articles is by a man named John Fordresher, and his picture is down here in the lower right-hand corner. He's a little older than I am, and he has written an article that people come to a lot when they say, how do we judge what work is worth studying and what isn't? And he says the first thing is we should look for texts, as he says, that explore emotion, intuition, mystery, the numinous, that is, things that are on the edge of being unseen, and the transcendent. And that, I think, is 4 or 5 different words put together to kind of suggest that we're looking for something special. We're looking for something that makes us think beyond the simple boundaries of time and space and character that we normally expect to see in a story. Okay. His second criteria is the idea of using language as language, looking at language in a different kind of way. And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to experiment like Cummings, but it's perhaps the kind of prose that we might see in Sonny's Blues, for instance, or we might see in Mark Twain, where the language is so evocative, we can put ourselves in the shoes of the characters. We can put ourselves in the place where the story occurs. Okay. His third criteria is this idea of figurative language. This applies mostly to poetry. If you look at something like Crossing Brooklyn Ferry and you see the kind of language that Whitman uses, sometimes it's a physical description, sometimes it's an emotional description, but the language is always sort of presented as a series of images that are powerful and create pictures in our heads that we can then understand the poem once we get those nailed down. And then his last criteria is this: we need to keep in mind the ways that a specific text positions itself in relationship to other works of literature, especially to other works in its genre. Okay, we've read a lot of poetry this semester, most of which is pretty different from each other. Dickinson is very different, for instance, from Paul Dunbar. But then we have other poets like Langston Hughes, and we're kind of wondering, what traditions does he draw on? Is he like Whitman? No. Is he more like Frost? Maybe. Is he like Natasha Trethewey or Jory Graham? Yes and no. And so this criteria is one that we might apply when we're looking within a genre to say, well, is this poem as good, whatever that means, as this other poem? Okay, so that's just an idea. None of these are meant to be exact or limiting, but it does show you the complexity that we're faced with when we're picking works for a course, for instance. Here's probably the important slide for you, and that is what makes an American work American. And I think this is kind of an arbitrary list that I made up myself today, that American literature in many cases, especially fiction, not poetry necessarily, but fiction, is always this individual fighting against something, fighting against the social structures that he or she is in. We might see that in Gilman's story, The Yellow Wallpaper. Where she's fighting against convention, she's fighting against the status quo. We might also see this in some of Chopin's writings, particularly The Storm, where the Calixta acts out of character and doesn't get punished for it. That's a pretty extraordinary thing. The story has a happy ending, and of course, Chopin tells us explicitly it's a happy ending. But that's where we're arguing against convention, we're arguing against structure, we're fighting our way out. Something similar goes on, I think, in Sonny's Blues, by the way, where you've got characters who are trying to fit in with their society, and then you have Sonny who doesn't. And then it's the narrator and the society that changes, not the individual. So Sonny is kind of the hero at the end of that story, which is an unconventional one, certainly when we think about the issue of somebody who's a drug addict. We also have, individuals versus other individuals. And of course, Sonny and his brother would be a perfect example of that. But we certainly see that conflict as being central to a story like Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, for instance. I've already mentioned gender when I talked about Yellow Wallpaper, but we've had other stories where people are fighting against the conventions of their gender, of the social rules. Daisy Miller is a good example of that, where there's a code of conduct expected of Americans living in Europe, and Daisy Miller doesn't follow any of those. And of course, unfortunately, it leads to her death. Identity is always an interesting thing, and that's because we're a country of immigrants. Everybody is here because they came from someplace else at some point in their past. And so, who are they? Do you get to come here and start all over again? Are you a new person? Or are you the person who brings all of your baggage from the old world or from your heritage? And does that hold you back? Okay. And so this is a really complex question. Who are we really? And this is something that comes up in American literature far more than it comes up in British literature, for instance, where the social roles are kind of fixed. The stereotypes are also kind of fixed. And so it's a society with more structure. We have a society where somebody can be a penniless immigrant and become a multi-billionaire. And we certainly have many people in our history who fit into that category. Okay. Another thing to think about are stories of westward expansion, about how the country has changed as it's gotten bigger, as we've literally decimated Native Americans, taken their land and built new cities on it and stuff. And does this make us an empire? Does this make us, if we think about our conquering of the American continent and then adding Hawaii and at one time Guam and the Philippines and a lot of other islands overseas, we still have Guam and Puerto Rico, for instance, as territories. We don't like to think of ourselves as an empire, but we are. And so the literature that we might be reading might reflect that in some way about what does it mean to have this uncomfortable position as a world power, but still not think of ourselves as a world power. That also goes to this idea of identity, just who are Americans? Something that comes up a lot is that Americans think of themselves as unique. There's this notion that people call American exceptionalism, where because of the fact that we've created a country in a particular place, in a particular time, in a particular way, a country whose main body, the continental United States, has never been attacked successfully. The only attack on American territory that's happened in the last 100 years was Pearl Harbor and 9/11. And those are kind of interesting cases because they're one-offs. They don't happen very often. We're not like England, which has had attempted invasion after attempted invasion, although none successful, since the 11th century. But we're different. We think we're special because People can succeed here in interesting kinds of ways. People can live with a certain element of freedom that may not be found in other countries. Um, and there are certainly a number of issues associated with that. But this notion that Americans are special, that they've been singled out by a divine creator for some purpose, is something that shows up in our literature a lot. Either celebration of that, an examination of it, or a deep critique of that particular perspective. The last thing is that some American literature, I don't think in our particular course that's addressed this, is this idea of that we lack a real culture, that we lack deep roots. Certainly, that's not something that Whitman or Dickinson cared about. It is something that Henry James, I think, might have cared about a little bit. But in his stories, we tend to look at how Americans live abroad and what they do and how they act with other people. And then, of course, there's the issue of race. And I didn't mean to do this, but it kind of works the way it's sort of historically accurate in that writers of color were always on the outside trying to get on the inside. Okay, and that struggle forms much of their literature. If we look at a poem like Langston Hughes' The Negro Speaks of Rivers, or Theme for English B, you get the sense that these are people who are knocking at the door of the dominant culture and saying, let us in. You certainly see this in Richard Wright's work. Race is the great sort of issue these days when we talk about, cancel culture or critical race theory or Black Lives Matter or how police treat African Americans. But in the literature, you see the same kinds of issues, if not the same kinds of political questions. So these are just a few of the things that I could think of that you might want to think about as specific American criteria to apply to the stories that we've been looking at. This is the last slide. This is actually the first one, and so this kind of gives you who people are. I'm sure you recognize Whitman. You probably recognize Emily Dickinson. This is the only photograph of her. This was Mark Twain at kind of the midpoint of his career, a little when he was wildly successful. This is Charlotte Perkin Gilman and her daughter. This is Eugene O'Neill, the writer of Long Day's Journey into Night. This is E.E. Cummings. There aren't a lot of photographs of him. I don't know why. This is James Baldwin over here on the left in this next row, and then this is Richard Wright. And so I put some of these pictures in just to let you know that American literature has an enormous range, an enormous power, zillions of writers, and zillions of large, complex, meaty issues. I can't imagine a more satisfying cultural experience than studying and reading American literature.